Beneath the sunlight and ceremony of Vatican City, past the tourists and the marble halls that gleam like mirrors of faith, there is a door that almost no one ever sees. Unmarked, iron, cold to the touch. Behind it lies what many call the most forbidden library on earth. For centuries, whispers have surrounded this vault, the Vatican Secret Archives, a place so protected that even its corridors are a secret. Inside, shelves stretch for nearly 50 miles, stacked with scrolls, letters, and decrees that trace the heartbeat of Western civilization. Yet only a handful of eyes have ever gazed upon them. Popes, trusted archivists, and on rare occasions, scholars whose names history barely remembers. They say the air inside smells of candle wax and centuries, that parchment curls like sleeping skin, and dust hangs in stillness as if afraid to settle. No voices rise here, no sound of footsteps echoes long. It is not silence that rules, but something deeper. The silence of containment. To some, this is merely the Church's administrative memory. Records of papal bulls, diplomatic correspondence, and inquisitions long forgotten. But to others, it's the locked vault of humanity's suppressed truth, hidden gospels, coded prophecies, proofs too dangerous to be spoken. Every great mystery begins with a door, and this one has remained closed for nearly half a millennium. When asked what lies within, Vatican officials respond with careful smiles. Only history. But history, when sealed, begins to change. It gathers myth like dust, and myth breeds questions. What does the Church fear we might find, or perhaps what does it fear we might understand? Because in a place built on divine light, this door remains devoted to shadow, and somewhere beyond it, history waits, still breathing in the dark. Every locked door invites imagination, and the Vatican's has invited centuries of it. Because when truth is hidden, rumor rushes in to fill the void. Across generations, tales have spread like wildfire through scholars, skeptics, and storytellers alike, that somewhere inside those sealed corridors lie documents capable of reshaping everything we know about history and faith itself. They speak of letters between emperors and angels, of records of celestial visitors witnessed by medieval popes, and of a bloodline said to descend directly from Christ. In dusty corners of conspiracy lore, the Vatican is painted as both guardian and jailer, a fortress built not only to preserve divine knowledge, but to keep it from the unworthy. It's said there are vaults that contain maps of lost continents, relics retrieved from tombs that never should have been opened, prophecies so precise they name wars before they happen, some whisper of hidden gospels describing Jesus not as a distant savior, but as a man who loved, argued, and doubted, a story too human to sustain a divine empire. Officially, church historians dismiss these claims as fantasy, romantic nonsense, they say, born from Dan Brown novels and fevered imaginations. Yet every denial seems to deepen belief. The more the Church assures the world that there is nothing to see, the more people become certain that something is being seen only by those who can never speak of it, because secrecy has its own gravity. It pulls the curious closer, generation after generation, and what was once simply an archive of papal letters has become, in the public mind, a chamber of forbidden truth, a place where the sacred and the profane might be filed side by side. Somewhere in those endless aisles of parchment and dust lies the question that haunts every believer and skeptic alike. What if the greatest secret the Vatican keeps is that it has one at all? The year was 1612. In a candlelit chamber deep within the Apostolic Palace, Pope Paul signed a decree that would alter the course of how the Church remembered itself. The Vatican archives, once scattered among monastic vaults and papal offices, were to be sealed, consolidated, and guarded under a new name, Archivum Secretum Vaticanum. To modern ears, the word secret rings with conspiracy, but in Latin, secretum meant something else. It meant private. These were not the Church's forbidden writings. They were its personal records, its correspondence, its memory. A library not for the curious, but for the custodians of faith. Yet privacy, when practiced for centuries, begins to look like concealment. Pope Paul V's intention was practical. The Church had grown vast. Its correspondence spanned continents and kings. Its decrees shaped empires. The archives would be its brain, a place where papal orders, royal petitions, and trial records could be preserved beyond the reach of chaos and politics. Inside these vaults, every letter between a pope and a prince, every judgment of the Inquisition, every whisper of heresy would be catalogued and sealed. Only a handful of clerics were granted entry. They swore oaths of silence, and their lives became defined by dust and discretion. To the outside world, the archives disappeared. For nearly 300 years, no historian, no scholar, no outsider saw what lay within. And so, over time, private became mysterious. Mysterious became forbidden. The word secretum, once harmless, transformed into something haunting, because the moment something is hidden, it stops belonging only to its keeper. It begins to belong to the imagination of everyone else. What Pope Paul V intended as order soon became legend, a legend that would outlive him and turn a library of parchment into the world's most guarded enigma. The paradox at the heart of the Vatican is almost poetic. The same institution that preserved the knowledge of Western civilization also feared what that knowledge might reveal. For centuries, the Church stood as humanity's greatest librarian, guardian of manuscripts, translators of ancient tongues, preservers of the very history that time tried to erase. But that duty came with a silent burden, deciding which truths were safe to remember and which were better left buried. Within the sealed vaults of the archives rest letters from condemned thinkers, pleas from kings, and confessions extracted in candlelit dungeons. The Church claimed it stored them for the faith, not to suppress, but to protect. Protect believers from scandal, protect doctrine from doubt, protect power from the chaos of unfiltered truth. Among those brittle pages lie transcripts from the Inquisition, scientists forced to kneel before theology, philosophers pleading for their lives. Some recanted, others vanished, and still their words survive, locked in drawers labeled not heretic, but classified. Historians granted rare glimpses describe the strangeness of it. Entire boxes marked only with initials, trial notes written in margins, ink faded as if ashamed to be read. Each fragment a reminder that truth, in the wrong hands, could ignite more than faith. It could start a revolution. And so the Church became both light and shadow, preserving the past, while deciding which parts of it the world deserved to see. Did it fear blasphemy or rebellion? Did it act from devotion or from control? No one outside those walls can answer. But perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is that every empire built on belief must one day choose between revelation and survival. The Vatican chose silence. And in that silence, the legend of its secrets only grew louder. Of all the legends whispered about the Vatican Secret Archives, none ignite more fascination or fear than those said to concern Jesus himself. They are called simply the Jesus Papers. According to rumor, these are ancient letters, correspondences between early followers of Christ, written not in reverence, but in recognition. They speak of a man who did not die on the cross, but lived, a man who fled, healed, and perhaps even married. Historians scoff. The Church dismisses the idea as sensational heresy born from fiction and conspiracy. Yet in the hushed corners of academia, a few declassified Vatican references from the 19th century hint at something unsettling. Unauthorized Gospels, documents reviewed and sealed for theological reasons, not destroyed, not denied, merely hidden. Among them, scholars speak of the Acts of Pilate, a Roman record said to detail the trial and aftermath of the crucifixion, and a mysterious Letter of Antioch, allegedly describing a teacher who escaped through the desert with his followers. None of these texts are officially acknowledged, but fragments of their descriptions appear in catalogs too old to fake, yet too ambiguous to confirm, and so the mystery deepens. If even a sliver of this were true, if such writings existed, it would not merely challenge faith, it would rewrite its foundation. A Christ who survived the cross would be human, not divine, a bloodline instead of a resurrection, a legacy of lineage, not salvation. The Vatican insists there are no such documents. But inside those sealed halls, among 50 miles of shelves, who could ever know for certain? Sometimes secrets do not survive because they are false, but because the world is not ready for what happens if they're true. And perhaps that is why the Jesus Papers, real or imagined, remain locked away in the one place where questions are preserved longer than answers. In 1917, 3 children claimed to have seen the Virgin Mary in the hills of Fatima, Portugal. The world was at war, empires were collapsing, and faith was trembling. Yet what they described, visions of a woman brighter than the sun, who delivered messages from heaven, would ripple through history, reaching all the way to the vaults of the Vatican itself. According to church accounts, the apparition revealed 3 secrets. The first 2 were made public decades later, warnings of hell, war, and the rise of atheistic regimes. But the third secret, the one written down by the last surviving child, Sister Lucia, was locked away for years, then decades, then nearly a century. It was said to be so terrifying that popes read it and wept. Whispers spread through seminaries and parishes alike that the final prophecy spoke not of salvation but annihilation. Some claimed it foresaw the Cold War and nuclear fire engulfing cities. Others believed it predicted the death of a pope and the fall of the church itself. When the Vatican finally released the third secret in 2000, it presented a symbolic vision, a pope shot, a ruined city, and martyrs falling. But even scholars of faith noticed inconsistencies. The tone felt incomplete, the language vague, and Sister Lucia, before her death, reportedly said what the world was told was not what she had written. Why would the church hide a prophecy meant for humanity? Perhaps, they said, to spare the faithful despair, or perhaps to spare its own authority. Because prophecy, once public, can't be controlled. It grows, evolves, terrifies, and within those marble walls of the Vatican, where truth is filtered through centuries of discretion, one question still burns. What if the final words of Fatima weren't about destruction at all, but revelation? In 1633, a frail man stood before a panel of robed cardinals in Rome, a man whose only crime was insisting that the earth moved. His name was Galileo Galilei, and his telescope had not only revealed new worlds in the sky, but exposed the cracks in the world below. For centuries, the heavens had belonged to theology. The stars were not questions, they were symbols of divine order. To challenge that order was to challenge the church itself, and yet, Galileo's eyes had seen what no scripture could describe: moons orbiting Jupiter, shadows crossing planets, silent mathematics of motion. He wrote that the universe was not centered around man, but around truth. When Vatican transcripts of his trial were finally declassified centuries later, they revealed not the fury of zealots, but the calm precision of bureaucracy. The inquisitor's words were not shouted, but measured. "We do not condemn his mind," one wrote, "only the danger of his example." Another note reads simply, "We must silence him to preserve order." Galileo was forced to kneel, to renounce what he knew, and to swear obedience to those who refused to look through his lens. Outside, the sun continued its quiet revolution, indifferent. The trial was never truly about astronomy. It was about authority. Faith could not risk being seen as wrong, even in the face of evidence written in the stars. Centuries later, Pope John Paul II would formally acknowledge the Church's error, but by then, the damage had been carved into history. Galileo died under house arrest, whispering, "And yet it moves." Some say the Vatican keeps the original notes of that trial deep within the archives, not to hide shame, but to remember the price of certainty. Because even the keepers of faith once feared the simplest truth of all, that the universe does not revolve around us. Tucked among the endless shelves of parchment and parchment-bound ledgers, scholars say there are manuscripts that do not belong to theology, but to something far stranger, technology. In 1998, a visiting researcher from Milan claimed to have seen a reference in the Vatican's internal catalog, Codex Volans, Volumes. The name means the Book of Flight. No official record of it exists outside those walls. Yet the phrase has haunted historians ever since. Some believe it to be an obscure work of Leonardo da Vinci, sketches of mechanical wings and aerial screw rotors that predate modern aviation by centuries. But others whisper that the handwriting in the description doesn't match his. It belonged instead to a monk, anonymous, meticulous, and forgotten, a man who may have built what the world was not yet ready to see. Rumors tell of a 16th century inventor cloistered in a small abbey near Bologna who corresponded secretly with Vatican engineers. His letters spoke of machines that mimic angels, of harnessing wind and weight to rise from earth as prayer does from breath. The Church, facing the chaos of the Reformation, supposedly suppressed his designs, not from fear of flight, but from fear of symbolism. To soar like angels was to rival heaven itself. If such blueprints exist, they lie somewhere in the labyrinth, folded in leather, ink faded to sepia. Perhaps the margins bear the signature of a genius erased by caution, or perhaps by obedience. Was he a heretic ahead of his time? A saint of science, silenced by faith? No one can say, but the whispers persist, that long before mankind conquered the skies, one man dreamed of doing so in the name of God, and the Vatican quietly clipped his wings. In 2020, for the first time in modern history, the Vatican opened one of its most anticipated and controversial archives. The records of Pope Pius XII, the wartime pontiff whose silence during the Holocaust had echoed for generations. Scholars had pleaded for decades to see what truly happened behind the closed doors of the Apostolic Palace as Europe descended into darkness. And when Pope Francis finally ordered the archives unsealed, hope and dread arrived in equal measure. Inside, historians found thousands of letters, desperate cries from Jewish families begging the Vatican for intervention, pleas for baptismal certificates to escape Nazi deportations, requests for sanctuary, and amid them, polite bureaucratic replies, acknowledgments, delays, silence. There was no smoking gun, no proof of evil intent, but there was something far more haunting: hesitation. A record of moral paralysis wrapped in diplomatic language. Pius, by many accounts, feared that open condemnation of Hitler would unleash greater persecution against Catholics and Jews alike. He chose caution over confrontation, prayer over protest. The Vatican defended him as a man trapped by impossible choices. Critics saw a shepherd who watched the wolves from the safety of his walls. Among the papers were handwritten notes, reports from bishops in occupied Poland describing the camps, the ghettos, the unspeakable horrors. Some bore his own annotations in the margins: brief, restrained, devastating. Pray. Cannot act. It was not malice that scholars uncovered, but fear. Fear of losing influence, fear of shattering faith, and perhaps fear that speaking the full truth would make silence impossible ever again. When those files were opened, the world expected to find villains or saints. Instead, it found men, bound by faith, but paralyzed by consequence. But even this great unsealing came with shadows. Researchers soon noticed irregularities, catalog gaps, mislabeled folders, documents referenced in indexes that no longer existed, a letter numbered 12B missing from a sequence of 14, a memorandum redacted in ink so dense it bled through the page. The Vatican explained these anomalies as clerical errors, a natural result of centuries of paperwork. But historians knew better. In archives as controlled as these, nothing disappears by accident. One German scholar described it best. It's like studying a tapestry from the back. You can trace the patterns, but you'll never see the full picture. Some files appeared to have been relocated just days before the official opening, logged as under restoration. Others bore new catalog dates, suggesting they had been reviewed internally before scholars were allowed access. The pattern felt deliberate, a quiet choreography of absence. Still, even fragments can tell stories. A single line in a letter, missing page in a sequence can speak louder than an intact record. One diary entry mentioned an order to conceal a 1942 communique. Another referenced discretion about transports. To those who study power, omission is a language of its own. And so, even as the Vatican declared transparency, its greatest secret remained. Not what it revealed, but what it withheld. Because history's most dangerous truths rarely vanish. They are simply misplaced, waiting for the right eyes to rediscover them. And the deeper historians dig, the more they realize that every answer inside the Vatican archives is shadowed by a question. If this is what they allowed the world to see, what remains sealed beneath the words "access denied"? For 7 centuries, the name Templar has carried the weight of both glory and curse. To some, they were holy warriors, the Church's armored hand in the Crusades. To others, they were mystics, bankers, and keepers of something far older than faith itself. When the Knights Templar were destroyed in 1312, burned, exiled, erased, the Vatican silence sealed their legend. Their leader, Jacques de Molay, died on the pyre, cursing both the King of France and the Pope who betrayed him. The Church called it justice. Historians called it politics. But in 2001, a discovery shook the academic world. a fragile bundle of parchment found misfiled deep within the Vatican's own archives, marked Chinon. Inside was the unthinkable, a papal document absolving the Templars of heresy, proof that Pope Clement V, under immense pressure from King Philip V of France, had not condemned the Templars for heresy at all. He had forgiven them. For 700 years, that truth lay buried, while the world believed the Templars died condemned. Their absolution was never shared, their honor never restored, until one Vatican researcher stumbled upon it by chance. Why reveal it now? Why, after centuries of secrecy, allow such a revelation to see the light? Some say the Church wished to cleanse an old wound, to rewrite a shameful page in its history. Others whisper of a deeper motive, that the Chinon parchment was a distraction, a controlled leak to feed curiosity while something greater remained sealed. Because if the Church could hide the absolution of an entire order for 7 centuries, what else has it chosen to forget? The Chinon discovery answered one question and opened 100 more. If the Templars were innocent, why were they truly destroyed? Some historians point to greed, their immense wealth and influence threatening the crown. But others suspect something more unsettling: knowledge. According to long-standing legend, the Templars unearthed sacred relics beneath the ruins of Solomon's temple. Scrolls, relics, perhaps even artifacts of unknown origin. They called it the Ark of Knowledge. Whatever it was, it made them powerful and perhaps heretical. Some claim that fragments of those discoveries, maps, coded writings, or relic inventories, were seized by the Church and locked away, eventually disappearing into the archives beneath Rome. Files marked not Templar, but restricted Crusades Division. Researchers who've traced Templar correspondence within Vatican records say entire chains of letters simply stopped mid-century, as if the order had been rewritten out of existence. And yet their symbols endure: the cross pate, the twin riders, the seal of secrecy. To this day, no full inventory of the Vatican's Templar materials has ever been released. When asked, archivists answer with silence or with the same phrase repeated like ritual: there's nothing to disclose. But perhaps the most chilling theory suggests the Templars' true treasure was not gold, but revelation, something that could upend both church and crown, a truth about divinity, bloodlines, or origins too dangerous for any institution to guard openly. If so, their crusade never ended. It merely went underground, continued by parchment instead of sword. And somewhere beyond the locked doors and marble corridors, the Vatican still keeps its hand upon their legacy, not out of reverence, but out of fear. Because the Templars may have fallen by fire, but their whispers still echo in the halls of faith. High on a mountain in Arizona, far from the domes and frescoes of Rome, stands one of the oldest astronomical institutions in the world, the Vatican Observatory. To many, it feels like a paradox. Why would the world's oldest religious power study the heavens with the same instruments once condemned as heretical? But for the Vatican, the stars have never been enemies of faith, only reflections of it. In recent decades, the observatory has partnered with NASA, ESA, and even SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Together, they've analyzed exoplanets, traced cosmic origins, and discussed the possibility, however remote, of life beyond Earth. Not as fantasy, but as theology. Jesuit scientists within the Vatican call it cosmic salvation, the belief that creation, in all its infinite scale, must also include infinite grace. If the universe holds countless worlds, does not the Creator's reach extend to them too? Would the story of redemption play out again among alien stars? For some in the church, this is profound spiritual progress. For others, it is heresy dressed as science. In 2014, a Vatican astronomer made headlines when he said, "If there are beings out there, they are our brothers. Baptizing them would not contradict our faith, it would fulfill it." Yet beneath the poetry of such ideas lies something more pragmatic and more secretive. The Vatican's modern fascination with astronomy isn't just about philosophy. Some claim it's about preparation. Across the decades, the Church has quietly built one of the world's most advanced optical instruments, the LUCIFER telescope, co-managed near Mount Graham. Its acronym, they say, is coincidence, but symbolism has power. And when an institution that once silenced Galileo now scans the stars, the question returns like an echo through time. What exactly is the Vatican looking for? The Vatican's gaze may now reach the stars, but some believe it has also looked into something closer and far more unsettling. Declassified U.S. intelligence from the early 1950s includes unusual correspondence between American diplomats and unnamed Vatican officials. The topic, unexplained aerial phenomena. The memos are brief, fragments of larger conversations, but they mention an exchange of information following sightings in Europe and the Mediterranean. One document, long buried in U.S. archives, refers cryptically to a report under seal within the Holy See. When journalists questioned the Vatican, officials denied any such meeting ever took place. But insiders, retired clerics, and archivists have told a different story. According to them, certain cosmic inquiries were quietly discussed at the highest levels of the Church, particularly during the Cold War when global powers feared not divine signs, but technological ones. A former Jesuit astronomer speaking anonymously in 2010 described a classified theological commission formed to address the theological implications of contact. The phrase he used has since become infamous: salvation beyond species. If these accounts are true, they suggest the Vatican has been preparing, not for proof of life elsewhere, but for the collapse of certainty here, because nothing shakes doctrine faster than discovery. Officially, the Church dismisses all talk of UFOs or hidden briefings as imagination, popular mythology with no foundation. Yet the Vatican's own scientists continue to speak of plurality in creation and the need to update theological frameworks for cosmic awareness. In a place where silence is policy, patterns speak louder than words. Partnerships with SETI, coded references to off-world theology, locked archives rumored to contain the Celestine Memorandum. Is it faith expanding or faith preparing for what it already knows? Because maybe the question isn't whether the Vatican believes in visitors from beyond, but whether those visitors long ago left something behind and the Church has been guarding it ever since. In 1976, a mid-level Vatican librarian named Father Enrico Lucchesi vanished without explanation. No obituary, no official transfer, no record of reassignment. He simply ceased to exist in the Vatican's personnel logs. Lucchesi had spent 15 years cataloging manuscripts no one else was allowed to touch. Secondary codices, he called them, boxes with no visible markings, cross-referenced under Latin aliases. According to colleagues, he was meticulous but restless, often muttering that the Church keeps history the way one keeps a prisoner. Then one afternoon, over coffee in Trastevere, he told a visiting academic something extraordinary, that he had seen a series of scrolls predating Christianity, documents describing a sun cult whose language mirrored early gospel phrasing. They file it, he said, under another name. They protect it by pretending it's something else. Weeks later, he was gone. The Vatican said he had retired to a monastery for health reasons. The monastery denied ever receiving him. For decades, Lucchesi's story lingered as rumor until 1999, when a set of handwritten notes surfaced in Rome's black market for antiquities. They were signed EL and written in the careful Latin script of an archivist. Among the entries, sketches of archaic symbols, references to Codex Prima Lux, and a chilling line in Italian, the beginning was not as told. Experts authenticated the ink and paper to the 1970s. Beyond that, nothing could be proven. The Vatican, as always, refused comment. Maybe Lucchesi was delusional. Maybe he uncovered something that history itself chose to forget. But in a city built on faith, even a whisper can echo for centuries. And when a man who lived among secrets disappears into silence, it's hard not to wonder, was it coincidence or containment? In 2012, the Vatican was shaken not by prophecy or archaeology, but by paper. A butler named Paolo Gabriele, personal aide to Pope Benedict XVI, began secretly photocopying letters from the pontiff's own desk. The documents revealed something few had ever dared to imagine. The Vatican's real war wasn't spiritual, it was internal. When the trove was published under the name Vatileaks, the world saw an institution entangled in politics, corruption, and quiet rivalries. Cardinals accusing each other of greed, secret commissions investigating money laundering, priests silenced for speaking too openly about reform. These weren't the grand conspiracies of legend. No aliens, no lost gospels, just the painfully human machinery of power. But that's what made it worse. Because if this is what escapes from the upper floors of the apostolic palace, what lies buried below? The Vatican called the butler a traitor, accusing him of betraying the trust of the Holy Father. Gabriele said he acted from conscience, that he wanted to expose the evil so the church might return to purity. He was arrested, tried, and imprisoned within Vatican City itself, a nation jailing its own citizen for the crime of transparency. The scandal passed, the Pope resigned months later, and the world moved on. But something fundamental had changed. The myth of infallibility had cracked, and for a moment the walls of the Vatican didn't seem impenetrable anymore. If internal letters could reveal so much darkness about earthly matters, what might the documents in the sealed vault say about heavenly ones? Perhaps Vatileaks was never the real leak, just the smallest drop from an ocean of secrets. Because in the Vatican, even the truth that reaches daylight feels like a message that escaped by mistake. Every secret ever whispered about the Vatican leads here to one question that dares not be asked aloud. What if the story was never true? Not a lie, not a fabrication, but something else entirely. A story that began as human and became divine through centuries of translation, interpretation, and control. Among historians who have studied the Church's earliest records, a few speak in cautious tones about the missing century, the unrecorded years between the death of Christ and the formal canonization of his story, a silence in which countless gospels were written, debated, and destroyed. Texts like the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, all banned, buried, or branded heretical. But what if the Vatican holds more than these? What if somewhere in the endless aisles of the archives lies an account, older, stranger, one that tells of a teacher who was mortal, whose miracles were metaphor, whose resurrection was not of flesh, but of idea? It would not destroy belief. It would redefine it. The church would no longer be the custodian of divine fact, but the curator of sacred myth, a story designed not to deceive, but to sustain. And that might be the most dangerous truth of all. Some scholars whisper that fragments of such writings were seen, cataloged under Apocrypha 17 and Codex Vetus 3. They describe not betrayal and resurrection, but exile and return. A man who fled persecution, whose words survived while his body did not. If that were real, if Christ's divinity were poetic rather than literal, then the foundation of faith would tremble, not because it was false, but because it was human. And perhaps that is what the Vatican truly protects. Not deception, but fragility. The fragile hope that belief itself might be more powerful than truth. Every civilization buries its own contradictions. But only the Vatican has made forgetting an art. For centuries, popes and archivists have chosen what humanity remembers and what it mercifully does not. Perhaps the deeper secret is not that they hid the truth, but that they carried its burden on our behalf. Because truth once revealed cannot be taken back. It fractures certainty. It empties altars. It turns revelation into archaeology. And maybe that is why some doors stay locked, not from fear, but from mercy. If the hidden documents tell a version of history that ends the need for faith, what happens to billions who build their lives upon it? If divinity is metaphor, does hope still heal the heart? Maybe the Vatican isn't guarding a scandal, but a mirror, one that shows humanity its own reflection, unfiltered and unsanctified. Yes, I shush. Reflection that says, you created the story you needed to survive. To reveal that might not liberate the world. It might break it. So the keepers of secrets choose silence, not because they are villains, but because someone must decide how much truth the world can bear. And in the silence lies the final paradox. Perhaps the church's greatest sin is not deception, but compassion, because some truths, once spoken, would unmake belief itself. And in a world desperate for meaning, the kindest thing a gatekeeper can do is keep the gate closed. The camera drifts once more through the Vatican's hidden corridors. Corridors that have watched centuries pass without speaking a word. Marble gives way to iron. Light fades into shadow. The hum of modern Rome disappears behind walls thick enough to hold silence itself. A single key turns in a lock. The narrator walks past gated rooms, whispering, "If truth lives here, it waits for someone brave enough to listen." Inside the vault, dust floats like ghosts of thought, fragments of breath from the men and women who once believed they were protecting God by protecting his secrets. Rows of sealed boxes stretch endlessly into the dark, labeled in Latin and time. Each one could hold an answer. Each one could unmake a myth. But there are no torches or revelations here, only stillness. And in that stillness, something sacred. The Vatican's archives are not what most imagine. Not a dungeon of forbidden texts, but a mirror of humanity's contradictions. Faith beside fear, knowledge beside denial. The Church has built its sanctum on a paradox. It claims to preserve divine truth by keeping some of it unseen. And so, the voice of truth itself becomes a whisper, a soundless hymn buried beneath centuries of obedience. Outside, Rome continues, tourists, bells, the rustle of pigeons. The world moves, never realizing how close it is to the heartbeat beneath their feet. And as the camera lingers on the final locked door, the voice returns, softer now. Every silence has a reason, every secret a prayer. Dawn creeps over the domes of Rome. The bells of St. Peter's toll, ancient iron announcing another day in a city that has seen too much and forgotten even more. The narrator stands overlooking the Vatican gardens, the skyline bathed in soft gold. The words fall slowly like confession. Faith demands mystery, but mystery demands honesty. It is easy to believe the Vatican guards power, harder to accept the idea that it guards fragility. The fragile line between faith and despair, between meaning and emptiness. Perhaps those who keep the vaults closed are not villains, but caretakers of something far more delicate than truth, hope. Because if all secrets were revealed, if every hidden document, every suppressed letter, every buried gospel were laid bare, would humanity find liberation or lose the only story that ever gave it light? The truth, once known, cannot be unseen. It demands transformation, and sometimes survival depends on silence. The screen fades to the streets of Rome awakening, pigeons scattering from the basilica steps, the air ringing with bells and morning prayers. Life goes on. Belief endures. Perhaps the Vatican does not protect us from lies at all. Perhaps it protects us from the truths that would break us. As the camera pulls away, the voice lowers to a whisper one final time. Maybe the silence of God isn't absence, but mercy. Fade to black.